There we go. I think I can't actually even see my mouse on this. So, welcome everyone. This is an advocacy group event, and I'll come to more about that. But today is about understanding emissions data, something we feel very important in the grand scheme of things of building the knowledge infrastructure as part of their Urban Health Council. So a little bit about us, for those that don't know, because I know there's a bunch of new people. Centric, we're a neuroscience lab. We create tools and strategies and work at 3 levels. We work with community groups. We work at the place level, so with regional authorities or infrastructure groups, or even, dare we say, real estate people trying to make a better place. But we also work at the city scale with policymakers, all with the aim of improving community health. But we also build out our own tools and resources, such as Know Your Health, which is a project we did in partnership with a design studio and an architecture practice, which is an introduction as to the urban environment, and you can learn insights about the broader world. We also create something called Right to Know. Right to Know is a geospatial tool that analyzes a variety of different environmental data sets, organized down to the postcode level from slightly larger data sets, but it's a way to start looking at environmental data trends and their relationship towards health. Then we also look at creating broader data sets so that we can start working more upstream with policymakers and start qualifying and quantifying the role that urbanization has in creating healthy places by looking at all of those pollutants en masse to understand whether an area is likely to cause a form of ill health to people. But today is about the Urban Health Council, which is why you're here, which is an initiative we set up it's towards the end of 2020. And it kind of says what it's on the tin. It is a research-led initiative. We like to work in collaboration with all of our members, and people on this call have contributed to shaping work. But we are very much an advocacy program, with the work that we're all trying to put together is towards shaping and influencing those trying to make change, whether it be at the policy, practice, or community level. So why do we exist? Because we have to challenge the idea that health is at the individual level. Yes, there are things that we can all do to manage health, but this culture erases the reality that habitats have on our health, and we believe health is ecological. We have a whole explanation and report series about that. We also set out an agenda that what we see a lot is the idea that policy is there to kind of manage harm and that there are safe levels. But it's unanimously agreed that there's no safe level of air pollution. So we challenge that through the work and the insights that we bring, and we also position everything so that we can root it more in our sort of spiritual relationship with land, nature, and place, something that has been lost in very sort of white Western epistemologies of health and ourselves in that way. But we also want to replace the antiquated systems. There's no point just giving the existing incumbents new insights to kind of still do what they do, but just be nice about it. And we want to actually invert the power pyramid and allow for what we produce at the Urban Health Councils to be produced by people actually at the impacts of urbanization, and that community-led knowledges are those issues that are driving the change rather than the kind of colonialist swoop, let's go look at other people and write about them. We want to invert that power pyramid, which is why the Health Council is open to everybody. It is funded hopefully by additional grant research by a lot of individuals. So if you can support, please do put some money in, which goes towards hiring people from all various backgrounds, as Araceli mentioned at the beginning. So the main way that we do this is, as you see on the left, we produce themes around reports. So Araceli earlier was talking about the planetary dysregulation in health. So we have, and with each one of those sort of 7 sections there are about between 3 and 5 different reports. That information there is a knowledge base. We're also looking at creating things like tools and lexicons, which is part of what's today. So this is a lexicon on health that we've got featured there. And the main other way that we do it is through events. And so we've been running a whole series of events. And this is actually the first advocacy group event. We've decided to kind of split things up a little bit more so that we're actually working with people in a more targeted approach. And today is about those working on major structural issues. We also have one for those who are and they're set up to work more at the place level, so working for and with people who work maybe in architecture through scenario modeling. We have an event lined up in July around that. So the purpose of today, really the aim of why we've done what we've done, is to help people navigate the complexities of environmental and emissions data. And so that navigating these complex elements, we can start to become more informed. We can actually have democracy, which is knowledge and power in this way. So this is the aim of today. We're hoping, as it says on the screen here, we want to support those who are addressing major structural issues. So this is typically those working around either policy influence or campaigners. And the aim is for us to provide additional insights that further the work. We're not trying to own the work, we want to support and help grow it forward. So, this section, or sorry, this advocacy group is based around this quarter's work, which, as Araceli mentioned before, whilst it's got the big term of climate change, we're actually reframing that to planetary dysregulation. And so as we look to build our infrastructure around this sort of knowledge infrastructure, we have started out by producing 4 fantastic pieces of work that the teams have put together that reframes how we have to move away from the language of climate change to that of planetary dysregulation. And so we can see there that the report on the top left is a much larger piece of work that's a PDF that you can download, and the other 3 are more sort of vignettes into the lived experience of those who are very much excluded from the conversation of climate change and the impacts around it. So once we actually understand what we're looking at from the broader planetary dysregulation, that is arguably brought forward by emissions, so pollutants and contaminants that are going into our environments, and just regulating natural habitats, which causing these impacts on our health. And so we set forth to go, well, actually, let's try and organize what's going on here before people start jumping around to something like air pollution data, which is really useful to look at. But we've also got to understand why we're looking at what elements within air pollution data, because people are often thrown various pieces, uninformed pieces or ill-informed pieces of information, and it can be quite hard to navigate and often sent around in a circle, getting kind of nowhere. And so that's kind of setting the basis of why we've come together today, that we are wanting to bring a level of insight to support people making a change. So what's going to happen now is that I'm going to ask Araceli to come back and speak a little bit more, that once we have, if we look at our kind of almost our ladder, our tree, or whatever, our funnel, that from the big side we've got accepting the planetary dysregulation and understanding this macro thing that is happening. Then we scale down to look at the emissions, and Daniel's going to explain a little bit more about the emissions. But obviously, once we look within emissions, we look at things like air pollution. And then the whole point about the Urban Health Council is to understand how all of these factors of urbanization and industrialization, and how we organize our sort of city through societies, have an impact on health. So without any introduction sort of further needed, Araceli, if you want to explain a little bit more about the health impacts from emissions, contaminants and pollutants, and what you've been working on.
Okay, Joe. So as we just said, the purpose of this event is to understand emissions data. So the first thing that we're going to do is going to break down air pollution. So there's 5 learnings to take into consideration. The first is, and for some of you this might be really rudimentary, but for some it might be new information, so bear with us, is that you've got 2 measurements, PM 2.5 and PM 10. That the PM is particle matter, i.e. the size of the actual particle, not the particle type. So you can have a sand particulate that is also PM 2.5, but you can also have a other type of emission that is also PM 2.5. So that's the first thing to understand, is that it's the size of the particle, not the type. As we know, not all particles or emissions are created equal. So when you are looking at emissions data, specifically of air pollution, or you're a community that is being asked, or you're monitoring air pollution, make sure that they give it to you, that they give you a delineation of the types of particles that are being emitted from a construction site or a landfill site, or a roundabout, for example. The next thing to consider is that PM 2.5 is a much smaller particle, which allows us to understand how air pollution affects us at a very biologically and systemic level. So these particles are small enough to come into our bodies through our nose and our mouths and into our bloodstream, therefore, unfortunately, spreading through to every organ. Versus PM10, which are a little bit larger particles that have to do with respiratory discomfort. So it can make you cough, it can make you sneeze, it can also actually affect hay fever, things like that. And what we are seeing, for example, is a pattern of organizations, and by organizations, I mean construction companies, environmental agency, et cetera, focusing on PM10 as a measurement, which technically is the whole picture. So if you are being told this is a reading of PM10, you're actually at very low risk. Don't take that at face value. Ask for a PM2.5 reading as well, because that is what's really going to get those long-term poor health outcomes that we are all experiencing, such as asthma, eczema, diabetes, obesity, etc. And that's what's really important in terms of environmental advocacy and agency, is that we learn to ask for the right thing, because they're tricky, and they're tricky on purpose. It's not the fault of the citizen. The next learning to consider is that a couple of lexicon words that we updated, that we no longer ask for cleaner air, but we ask for clean air. It's a massive difference legally, and it's a massive difference to our health. When you say clean air, they love to clap their hands and pat themselves on the back, because we're like, oh, instead of 15 cars, now we only got 5 cars. Thumbs up, cleaner air. That's not going to make a difference to your health. That is still health injustice. The cars are being deviated to another neighborhood and polluting somewhere else. So we must learn to start asking for clean air and pay attention to those gaslighty type vocabulary of agencies and organizations advocating just for cleaner air. The next thing to consider is the way that we talk about air pollution, that we start talking about it as a hazard that creates a health risk versus a potential health risk. It's not a potential. The WHO has declared it that there are no safe levels of air pollution. What that means is that with every particle that we ingest of air pollution, our bodies are having to combat it. And that's one of the 2 pathways that air pollution affects us. Actually, one of 3. The first being, as I said, directly ingesting, it goes into our bloodstream and creating inflammation. But that inflammation engages our stress response, which is also a secondary form of inflammation. And that's where you start to get what is called allostatic load. You start heading towards those long-term diseases. But also, when you're advocating for clean air, when you are aware that you are being polluted, it's also a mental health burden. People often suffer from depression and anxiety, hopelessness, because they're not being listened to, because they're being gaslit. So it's unfortunately a very robust way that it affects us. Therefore, talking about it as a hazard and as a health risk is important. And finally, the next thing, because I already said no safe levels, the next thing is to add to our vocabulary is something called sacrifice zones. I don't know if y'all have heard of it before, it's new to me, but sacrifice zones are essentially neighborhoods with racialized and other marginalized communities where companies and industry are given the legal right to emit, to pollute our land, air, and water. It's a thing of allowing how much can we put into the atmosphere before we really wreck people's health. And we have to start switching that mentality. I mean, I say we as a society, not us as citizens, because we're not doing the damage, but it's asking them to change that mentality as citizens to advocate. We're no longer going to tolerate for you to have a legal right, a legal amount for you to pollute us. And then the sacrifice zones are areas where they're like, it's okay, here we can pump more, because they deem the community non-valuable. So for example, one of the godfathers of this type of work, Professor Bullard, in Houston, he did the first mappings of where landfill sites were located in relationship to African American and Native American communities. 90% of the landfill sites were located in Native American and African American communities. And that's what we mean. Those communities, those areas are sacrifice zones, that people are okay. And they, like I said, this is systemic. So we have to think how the law allows for certain areas, certain communities to be sacrificed for capitalism, for industry. And the final thing to consider is that, as Josh already said, so I'm not going to go too deeply into it, is that when we're talking about climate change or climate crisis, again, having that update that we have to include things like air pollution and land pollution and water pollution, because that's where it starts. That's where, excuse me, the deregulation starts. So from obviously the emissions that go up into the air, they also get into our water and they get into our soil, which means in the soil, that they're changing overall the microbiome of our external environment and thus affecting our health. But that change in the microbiome, which in detail is in the report on planetary deregulation, you're changing the way that biodiversity can flourish. If we're changing that, we're changing our own way of life. And so we have to start at these small building blocks and not just be allowed to be overwhelmed by these big languages of like, what are we going to do when the flood hits? And yes, we have to pay attention to that. And yes, we have to pay attention to the infamous CO2 emissions, but we also have to be paying attention to the way that they are polluting us on a daily level and how that is the first building block to the bigger crisis that we are seeing both in planet health and in human health. Okay, so I pass it on to Dan now.
All right, lovely, thanks. So the lexicon. So I guess to give a bit of context for people who are new, who don't know me, I generally do more of the data. So like my first thing at Centric was the stress risk score, which the idea was that there was the lived experience of saying London has different pollutants. I feel different things when I'm in different parts, by high streets, by parks, but how do you legitimize that a bit to turn it into something translatable, like numbers, like data, but still carry over the effect of what's intended, which is explaining why one place might be worse than the other, why one might have a different impact to the other. And so that's kind of been a lot of the through line of what I've done in this work. But the whole point in this lexicon is when you really look at it, no data is ever just made arbitrarily, right? Data is inherently, the science is inherently political to some way, it is inherently cultural. And so every time you look at anything from air pollution, deprivation, they always have README files. They always have things that tell you this is where you can use it. And these are things that people should be reading, because if you only look at things at face value, sometimes you might miss the point. Sometimes you might turn it into something that it wasn't intended to be. And that's all part of data literacy and part of this practice of saying, sometimes this data set that you're really excited about might not answer all your questions, but it might answer one or two. And so the point of making this lexicon around environmental data and health is really the fact that some people find the culture of environmental health intimidating, or they might think that because I don't follow, as Araceli said, all the latest trends on CO2, then it must not be relevant to what I do daily. But the thing is, if we go back to that theme of planetary dysregulation, it all ties in together. So even if you aren't the agency, the organization, the plant doing these things, at the same time, your interest and your understanding of it as a community could lead to advocacy, could lead to you saying, well, one of us eventually is going to work there or become a politician that actually has access. But if you haven't been practiced in understanding the data and the language, then then people are never going to be able to come together to actually make these changes. And so our intention for this kind of reads to these three things, right? One of them is the journalist, because what you realize is that even in science, the journalists have a lot of power over how to connect ideas and how to legitimize ideas and how to get people comfortable with approaching different data and different topics. And then the platform for communities is because people are feeling these things, they understand it, they see the plant, they have these ideas that maybe if I go to this field, I might be healthier or not healthier. But there are organizations that are actually collecting this data, that have bigger scale than an individual. So it's about allowing communities to then take this lexicon, take the ability to understand this data and use it for their decision making. But ultimately, it's also about government authorities and people who want to be policymakers being able to tie themselves to the language, to the type of data that already exists through non-for-profits, through open data, through things that private companies are doing that they're leaving open, but they're not really directing anyone to, and allowing them to incorporate that into actual law, which then ties into how the communities can use it for their own advocacy. The next slide. And so how it's laid out is we've basically laid it out into three things. We've got the lexicon, which is more about the how-to. So it's setting up some of the misconceptions or clarifying some of the ideas so people get more comfortable with when certain topics and certain types of data are relevant. And then the definitions really come down to more specific. So they're very just, here's the word, here's what it actually means. So in data, a lot of organizations, a lot of the emissions, they are specific things that have a way they're set up. They have a way we understand what they do, etc. So the definition section is really about that. And then investigations is kind of a culmination of the first two, where it allows you to narrow down and say, well, now if I know more about CO2, understand the definition, what kind of impacts it has, I can start seeing how does understanding data on CO2 help me with some local advocacy, or how does it help me figure out how do I hold a certain entity accountable? And so we kind of have these three together to hopefully allow people to see a through line to how they can understand environmental data and the impact it can have for their advocacy. So next slide. And so the key insights, so these are just a few excerpts from different parts of the lexicon. But basically the first one is really just about the fact that it goes to my first point about how even if your campaign isn't about air pollution, your campaign might be just about that you're noticing something locally, or that you want to make the school have a clearer way, but you don't know anything about policy, you don't know anything about this, you've just seen the impact. Is you basically all the data and all the all the things that you can use for environmental data can actually support that sort of work by saying, well, here's the trends of the last 15 years that tell you that there's a reason why, as Araceli was alluding to, this place was built where it was. There's some history and some things that receipts that people have to say that the marginalization was structural, and it isn't just that these kids happen to be sick because of their lifestyle or because of their precondition. But then when you look at analysis from averages are very easy for people to understand. But when it comes to certain things like health, things like averages aren't always enough. And it's helpful for people to practice other forms of analysis, because we use things like top 10s and top 15 sometimes, because it's not about what happens often, it's about how often does it go past a threshold. Because with a lot of health things, it only takes 1 or 2 times above a threshold for people to get irreversibly damaged. And then it doesn't matter what the average was. It doesn't matter that another part of the city feels less. And sometimes that's, depending on how you deal with the political boundaries, it's very easy to iron out some really problematic spots by some nice spots around them. So we hope that introducing these different analysis allows people to understand that there are other ways of looking at data. But then the last thing is that a lot of the data, when you find them, things like WHO, they're all tied to targets, SDGs, they're tied to targets that are political. So they're not always about science. A lot of the times these targets are compromises between the politics and the science. So there are ways of saying that, we wouldn't convince everyone to go to 0. So let's start at 15 and see if we can get the companies on board. So when you understand that, you understand, again, how not to compromise on just saying that, because it's what this one data set says, then it means it's good for me. But actually realizing that this might be a compromise, and you might be someone or in a category or in a location that needs to do better than that, or that you understand that the bigger picture of what true planetary regulation looks like. so you can.
Amazing. So I think, Daniel, thank you very much for that. Dan was the lead author for producing this Lexicon, which is almost as much as a toolkit. And I think, if I may just add, when we were designing Right to Know, which is a tool, so Right to Know with hyphens in the middle.org, where you can enter in your postcode and understand the trends, you'll see that we organize the air pollution data from the top 10%. So we're looking at the peaks of that very point, that by just using the averages, we would have the responsibility of miscommunicating actually what is a health risk. So there, there's an example of which we've endeavored to put a number of these learnings into practice. But that's really kind of what we've done. I'm going to obviously put the link to this in the chat. I realized I hadn't sent this through, but it is a growing resource. So it's not 100% finished. We plan to grow this more and more with different partners and funders that come on board. So it becomes hopefully much more of a stronger, definitive resource for a variety of people. So I'll open up to questions, and hopefully there will be questions and people can put their hands up, and then we'll get around to if there are any other sort of shout outs of different activities, campaigns, organizations that people want to share to others on the call. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen so I can actually find my cursor and send the link in the chat.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
My question is to Daniel. What would you envision as your big macro goal for the environmental data lexicon? Like, where, if you were like, this is the trajectory, this is how ideally it serves the community, what would you say to that?
I think that the number one thing would probably, like, I'm really into the iterative processes. So like, I like the idea that if people feel comfortable saying that this is what I'm experiencing, this is what I'm kind of wondering, but can you know, like kind of getting away from the idea that everyone has to do their own research, because like sometimes that's very tiring and it puts a lot of weight on people. But I think that even just from, like I was saying, when we put things like the SRS together, there was a lot of like digging I always have to do about why people put information together. Every one of these posts, I thought I knew stuff, but even like the AQI one, it's like I didn't even realize that the AQI, there isn't just one AQI. It's like they're all determined by the policies of that given country. So so one air quality index might be very liberal because it's like that country is actually doesn't really care about air pollution as much, and one might be stricter because they have a better culture around it. But these things aren't very transparent. So if people, I feel like if people were more comfortable being able to say, here's even I think you should work with, or here's data I'm trying to understand, or can that be put in some way where it's useful for me and people like me? I think those kind of questions will show that it's progressed to a way where people are truly using it as like not a standalone tool that they think knows everything, but as like an iterative tool that's continuing to grow with them. So I think if that answers the question properly.
No, it does. No, that's dope. Okay, cool. And Josh?
No, I don't have a question, unfortunately. I think I worked too much on it with Daniel to have an explicit question, but I've just put the links in the chat for people to observe. I don't know whether Guppy and Sonora, the fact that you put on your videos means that you might have a question that you wanted to ask, or an observation. Both of you are still muted.
I didn't. I was just here to listen in, but this is so exciting. And from Daniel's discussion of like how it could be an iterative thing, it's really exciting to just kind of envision the different components of environmental data that could become included and how that can be used for communities. I hope it gets to that point.
Cool, thank you. Sorry to throw you in that. I just, when you see someone's camera pop up, they're like, okay, I'm ready to be heard now. That's
I'll ask a question, Josh. Good to see you.
Hey, Carl.
Yeah, I'll put my camera on for a second. You got quite a nice beard going on, Josh. But I guess the question is, I guess, where do we take this from here, and like what can this group do to help support this and make sure that, you know, this is delivered? I guess is my question. It's like how can we as a group kind of take this forward, or what are your thoughts around that?
So I'll partly answer, and I don't know if Dan, Shelley, if you have any responses, but I think there's a few things. So with the Urban Health Council as a macro, the primary aim is to support people who are trying to look for change with new resources. So the key aim of this is to empower those already working at the level with additional insights, framing, and tools to empower their work. Something, the kind of like the second strand of what we're endeavoring to do at the Health Council is to start on, I want to say kind of like pressuring in a more structural and positive way by organizing events with, you know, consortiums of GPs and clinical commissioning groups to start understanding how we can start to include place-based data on things like pollutants and how they may be recorded alongside individual health factors at a GP level. Equally, from the built environment point of view, how do we start leveraging and encouraging those at the practice level to rethink how they're looking at, for example, the equalities impact assessments. So something that's typically done, you know, as I'm sure you're aware, by a large organization when they're looking to make macro structural change to a place, they will do a health impact assessment. They'll sometimes do a climate, but they'll do an equalities one. And this is at the moment a very box ticking exercise. And so what, for example, in the research that's been produced within this quarter, we have presented 3 vignettes in how someone who's part of a transgender community, about how they are being impacted by issues of climate change. The same with people from disabled communities, what it is to be told, oh, well, if a hurricane or a storm comes, try and, put a mattress on top of you. Well, if you're in a wheelchair, that's pretty hard to do. And so in these learnings, we hope to provide the insights to people making the decisions that when they are reviewing a situation, they are starting to ask these questions. So I think that's the main part there, is just how do we start providing tools to help people ask better questions. So that's really where we're trying to position a lot of this work. I think there are already very strong campaign groups. I know Rhiannon's who's on the call is a medic and a big campaigner. You may have, who recently was right in front of Downing Street campaigning on issues. And so, there are people who are already doing that. And so our job is to kind of get this information to them, because they're at the right sort of layer and level to do that. So, to us, crying outside Downing Street, yeah, I think we all, I would be spitting outside Downing Street if it were up to me. So, I know that's I guess the most appropriate answer I could give to you, Carl, in this, like, how do we start getting this, really, because this is knowledge, it's about putting knowledge in everyone's hands. So it's sharing it, it's moving it on, it's telling people to come along to the next event, it's just sending them the links. I think those 2 routes that I mentioned around how do we then bring consortiums of GPs together is a very important one. And then how do we start telling all the planning authorities, your climate and impact assessments are pathetic. They need to be updated, and they're very simple mechanisms that can be. So I think those are key things. And so I've gone on for a while, but you've got maybe a response?
All I was going to say is, I think, I like how we've separated from like advocacy. And I think that's where, obviously everyone on this call is very aware or wants to learn more about these issues and wants to do something about it. It's just how, I think the big, the crux of it is kind of like you said, it's like, how do you get into the hands of individuals that aren't thinking about this, or they may not be a top priority, and how do we kind of sway and convince these individuals? I think that's because I can tell you from a real estate perspective, from a built environment, a lot of times it is a tick box exercise. It's like, well, regulators ask us to do this, that's why we do it, otherwise we wouldn't do this stuff. So it's like, what is the path of least resistance to really start making some progress, is part of the question. But maybe something that this group can help figure out.
Yeah, I mean that's really what we're trying to do with the Health Council is find those means. But Rhiannon, I mean, you've got your hand up, and I think you work in this sector. I mean, do you have a response to Kyle's point, or is it more in general?
Yeah, I mean, it was just like something I thought to say in response to Kyle's. I don't know if it's direct, but just like spot like something that I found like data like this, or like the Centric Lab's work, or data like this really useful for, is like helping to handhold kind of stale institutions into more radical positions. So I work a lot with like I sit on the executive of the UK Health Alliance on Climate Change, which is all the Royal Colleges, which tend to be very resistant to anything remotely interesting when it comes to like big radical change or anything like that. So I found like data which can help to push and bring like kind of otherwise reluctant institutions to much better positions has been really, really useful, and particular when that's targeted at like specific UK government policies. So it was like for a recent piece of work, it was about 6 months of like meetings using data, like very useful, more radical data, to then convince people to like oppose a specific policy. So it was like kind of using that data as a build up to trying to get institutions with power and influence to use it a lot better. Obviously not perfect at all, but like that's what I found data like this really useful for doing.
Yeah, I mean, I do have a follow-up, but I know a few people have their hands raised, so I'll just be quiet, Josh, for now. So like got the conversation going, hopefully. But
thanks, Kyle. Jelly, did you want to say something quickly, or should we go to the other hands that are up?
No, I can wait as well.
Okay. Joanna, you've been kindly patient and waiting. You have a question or a follow-on from the point?
Yeah, I really want to reiterate that point about stale institutions. So I work for Natural Resources Wales, and as an institution, we're doing a lot of work internally to really try and meet the challenges that we face. So with the equivalent of the Environment Agency, but we also cover all of the natural resources in Wales. So we have got a more holistic approach. And just to reiterate, really, we've got a meeting on Friday morning to decide how to bring our most senior leaders on board with a kind of environmental justice perspective, and they want us to tell them what that means. So this work is just incredibly helpful and keeps us inspired when we're in those difficult meetings, kind of trying to drag people along with us. And also just to reiterate that point about like, we started doing some training with GPs in Wales. So we're working with the program of training of all the trainee GPs in Wales, and we did introduce some of your tools to one of the groups. And it's not that they're not interested, but I feel like we had to go right back to basics and really start off the conversation about why is an environmental organization here in the first place? Why are you interested in health? Why are we having this conversation? So I think we will get here, but sometimes we just need to start at the very beginning as well.
Thank you very much for that, Joanna. Sonora, you were next with your hand up, so feel free to unmute yourself.
I have a quick question for everyone using data to try to move these stale organizations along. What kinds of data have you found useful in this? And then, like more specifically, what data is credible enough for that purpose? So, for example, could data that is collected by communities themselves be used for those purposes? And would you find that credible enough in the eyes of those institutions? Also, would that kind of data be something that could be integrated into Centric Lab's tools?
Great question. I don't know, Dan or Chelly, do you have a particular, because we've cut and sliced this in many different ways. I don't know, either one of you jump ahead, because I think this is slightly more your domains.
Wait, but I think, was that not a question for the people who had taught, like for Rhiannon and Joanna, who had mentioned that they're doing that work? Because I'm actually kind of curious about this. This is like literally this kind of stuff I want to nerd out on. So,
so Sonora, was that open to everyone, or was that directed at like Joanna and Rhiannon? Everyone.
Everyone. Yeah.
Everyone. Yeah, I want to sit back and hear what people that are, because that's who I want to, that's going to be like my next through line. So.
Well, if I just chime in from the Centric perspective, because yeah, Dan, the three of us, and also Marie, who's on the call, we've had these really long discussions. First of all, 100%, we are very, very interested in community-led and gathered and analyzed data. We are crossing our eyebrows and fingers and eyes that we get some foundational funding soon, because that's what we want to do, is pass on that funding so communities can begin to do this, so we can support communities doing that. Because we're a mighty team, but sometimes we move quite slow. Dan, Marie, and I, we are pushing forward the air pollution toolkit that is going to be, hopefully, it's been in the works for, oh my God, like centuries, but it looks like we're coming finally to a headway to be able to release it. But that's going to be our first step into putting a survey out for communities who are experiencing acute levels of air pollution, so we can start monitoring symptom clusters. Because in terms of your other question of like, how do you use data to move? It really is in advocacy. It's support. It's just being a really great comrade to the communities that are already doing the work, because those institutions, they don't want to change because they're driven by in the capital. And so what our dream is that we get critical mass with something like the air pollution toolkit, because they can't ignore it, right? So if you've got 7, 8, 10 communities in various parts of the UK with various different types of air pollution problems, whether it's a gasworks site or a landfill site, and they're all experiencing these clusters of symptoms, especially at the very beginning, where you can't get a diagnosis with with runny noses, bloody noses, which is happening across the board, and or respiratory problems, et cetera, et cetera. Then we have a case where like, you can't ignore this critical mass, right? And that's where we have learned our lesson, because we have also learned our lesson that you can come back with the most pristine data and the most pristine mathematical statistical argument, and they will still gaslight you and be like, but we've analyzed it this way, and we don't conclude the same thing. Like, we've actually been told that the science that Centric is doing, is it valid? And I'm like, science is science. You either do it at a good quality or at a shitty quality, but science is science. So that's where we're hoping, is that we get the critical mass from the communities, the critical mass from citizens. So then that begins to affect the top people.
And I just wanted to quickly add that the one thing we've also found is sometimes like, we do a combination. We've historically done a combination of like, but what we find is that a lot of these organizations, they like to kind of take a handful of things, like a handful of like quotes or numbers from the top, and then they just kind of pass it around, and then they paraphrase it in a report, and it just becomes like diluted. So by the time it gets brought to a community, the person who's actually doing the implementation doesn't really actually know the background behind why that number is being used or why that term is being used. And so some of the times all we've actually done is gone directly to the WHO's leaflet itself and said, well, this is what WHO actually said directly, not what you put in your report that you sent to the community. And sometimes even that is just kind of, because the people in the middle ground, sometimes they're just bureaucratically doing things. So they're not even like the researchers or the scientists. They're the person that's supposed to just be put in front of a community to silence them or to say, we did do our research. Because we've had times where we're just like, okay, there's like basically WHO, for instance, they say exactly what we say, which is that there's no good level of air pollution, but this is a very much a country by country, industry by industry mitigation and compromise. But most of these times, if you find any of these organizations that are on a national level, they won't give you that. They will just tell you, we measured this, which is not this number, therefore we don't need any liability or work. So it's like, sometimes it's not even complicated data. It's actually just going back and reading one of maybe 5 documents that have existed for 10, 15 years that just no one actually bothers to check again. So I just wanted to add that because it was quite relevant.
So no, Guppy's had her hand up very patiently for a long time, but just if there is anyone else that wants to contribute to that answer, please feel free. Otherwise, I'm sensing no, so we will go to Guppy.
I feel like I said this at the last one, so I might just be repeating myself. But with both Right to Know tool and our work on data, I guess maybe it comes back to kind of Carl's question around like where to go now. And there is, in my mind, you know, part of the reason that we've got sort of layers of information and are trying to interrogate like what creates a data set and how the data set is actually like developed and through what information and what sources, is because with all of the work on air pollution, there's obviously like a justice and class angle to health outcomes. And so if the data in itself is like alive in that way, and both acts as a challenge to traditional forms of scientific knowledge production, but also as an organizing tool, I suppose in my mind there's this question about or a need for some attention in the use of the data for different groups of people who might hold different responsibilities when we take action and when we advocate. And so a kind of a working class multiracial community that Centric have been working with will use the data as a form to challenge like gaslighting of their own experiences and to like self-determine the space in which they live and to advocate for the changes that are necessary for them to live healthy lives. What could happen in a more mixed class, multiracial space is like, there is a history of air pollution data being used by like middle class mums to advocate for solutions that are like not helpful. And I suppose we are creating data sets that like don't allow for those solutions to exist. And I suppose that's part of the purpose. It's like, it is so complete in expressing the complexity of intersections of like exposures and oppressions that no false solution can be created. And I suppose that's part of the work. But we also have to remember to like express that in what the data is, you know, and how the data was sourced and what it's been used for and how we advocate with it, is because it has to shift the practice and strategy of traditional forms of air pollution campaigning or like environmental justice campaigning, because it can't be justice oriented if it's not got that dynamic to it. So then when you think about things like, you know, I'm making a massive assumption that a bunch of us in this space are like professionals of some kind. And so what does the kind of committed justice focused professional who might have their own experience in this space, but also want to bring that to shift institutions, like what do we do with that when we use the data to advocate for change? And then like, what are the other roles that might exist in an advocacy strategy for, challenging the kind of like, the problems that we're facing. And so I guess in terms of like next steps, I'm like thinking a lot about that and have been thinking about that since we like released Right to Know, because we got some really interesting insights from like whole groups of people about what they could do with it. But I suppose we still need to like get that investment and time to like do concerted support for organizing at a local level that we like, yeah, we would want it to continue to be more alive and active as an organizing tool and just an information tool.
Awesome. Thank you, Guppy. So we've got a few minutes left. I'm sure there's a couple more questions that people could ask. I know I want to say something, I think Carl wanted to say something, but then that's very typical of us kind of men. We always like, let's talk. But before we close out, I wanted to make sure that anyone could give a shout out to something that they're working on. This is an advocacy group, so there are people from different sectors who probably want to share out a project, an event, a campaign, an initiative, an article, whatever it may be. If you want to shout out, it could be a research project that you want support to. We just want to make sure that this platform and space is available, that it isn't, you know, the Urban Health Council exists for the people that come to it, that kind of make it. It's, we don't want it to be only a top-down thing. We want people to also, if we could say it bottom up in the right way. So kind of floor's open. If anyone wants to give a shout out to anything that they're doing or working on, you can either put it in the link or yeah, just unmute and fire away. Jake.
Hello. Probably just a quick shout out that we are launching an inclusive innovation district called Shift on the Olympic Park in Stratford in East London on Friday. And one of the pillars of innovation is all around health. And I've been doing a lot of work with Centric Lab over the years I work for Lendlease, so a big property developer, but trying to really get people who don't normally care about these types of things to care about these types of things and find a sense of responsibility, how we kind of build this thinking, scientific thinking into our work and kind of really elevate the knowledge of health beyond let's plant trees because people like trees, to, you know, really more fundamental understanding of what we're working on health. Anyways, we're a part of the Shift, so we're basically launching on Friday at London Tech Week, and we'll hopefully be doing a piece of work with Centric around creating a kind of health strategy for across the 4 boroughs instead of across the park, and then hopefully we'll be having some of our first innovation trials up and running over the summer. So if anyone's keen to use the park as a sort of test bed around air quality, different health metrics, I hear all ideas that everyone has. I've got 4 boroughs who are really keen, especially Newham, to work with us. And Newham's got a whole thing on data-led impact projects. Yes, I can share a link. I have a website that will be launched in 24 hours. I can send the links actually here for the event.
How many times have you ended up saying, oh, it's launching in 24 hours in the past 2 months?
Oh no, the website I knew wasn't going to be until the last possible minute. So that's the link to the London Tech Week, and then the Eventbrite is for if anyone wants to dial in virtually. As it'll be streamed, then it'll be on YouTube as well. But if anyone wants to come physically at Here East on Friday, let me know. I can get you on the list. So it'll be good stuff. And there's a lunch afterwards as well, so I can give you some free food and even a drink.
Should have opened with that, Jake.
35-degree heat. So yeah, sorry for the shameless plug, but
no, this is what this section's for. That's awesome. Thanks, Jake. Yeah, anyone else? I know Rhiannon, you're involved in many things. Guppy, anything for decolonizing economics and the events coming up. Hanny, I know you guys are involved in some very cool work. So yeah, just want to make sure that people aren't afraid to shout out. Bye, Kyle.
I will quickly jump in to plug Race and Health's work on environmental equity that we're doing at the moment. Our podcast has recently launched. We're doing a series on envision environmental equity. So I'll put the link to it in the chat. The rest of our outputs will be coming up soon and are not quite there yet, but that's the first of them so far.
Awesome, thank you for that. Cool. Well, look, it's 3 o'clock. Well, it's actually 3:01. Thanks, everyone. I hope this is useful. Got to see the lexicon, kind of the next part of what we're working on, and that will continue to grow. So, you know, please share it. Please send it around. This is infrastructure. It's there to support everyone and increase equity in our society. So, yeah, please do what you want with it, and we hope it helps. And if you have any questions, drop us a note. But yeah, thanks very much, everyone, and we will hopefully see you at the next event. Take care.